Thank you for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're located, uh, for sharing data securely with Galen Charlton. Before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsors for this year's conference, the Evergreen Collaborative Development Initiative, Midwest Tapes, Hoopla, Equinox, Stack Courier, and Unique. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Galen.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so my name is Galen Charlton. I am the Implementation and IT Manager at the Equinox Open Library Initiative. Um, and I'm also an Evergreen developer and have been active in the Evergreen community since about 2009. And the topic of this presentation is naturally, as you would expect, ultimately about toxic waste. So I will turn off my camera and go ahead and explain what I mean by that. So first, to set the stage, back in the day, the integrated library system may have been a thing that was accessed only in the library through green screen terminals. But of course, nowadays, very few Evergreen systems are completely self-contained. By necessity, most interact with third-party systems for a variety of purposes, including authenticating users, loading metadata from other sources, bringing in enhanced content, and the like. And almost all of those integrations necessarily require that data be shared between Evergreen and the other system. And you may be looking at this slide and asking yourself, okay, why the funky Zago text formatting of the word data? And that is because, in the words of Bruce Schneier, data is a toxic asset. Now, data is legitimately an asset. Obviously, the library catalog is full of data. There are lots of reasons to keep track of data, not only about the library's collections, but about your patrons and how they interact with library services. But data in and of itself also imposes costs. There's the factor as far as cataloging and metadata is concerned, the cost of data maintenance, the cost of maintaining data about patrons, and so forth. But what can make data toxic is the fact that it can have risk associated with it. And this includes risks to the library. A data breach can be quite expensive, both in terms of direct financial cost, remediation costs, and harm to the library's reputation. But more importantly, it can also be costly and harmful to the patrons whose data has been leaked or otherwise breached. And some of the potential harms apply to most any database with information about people, basic contact information, can potentially be combined with other sources. if you're collecting credit card numbers to pay patron fines, that can also be a source of risk. However, there are, of course, library-specific aspects to how library databases can be toxic. And in particular, um, a core value of libraries is the need to protect the privacy of their patrons um, with respect to how they use library resources um, and with respect to the intellectual work or the entertainment they receive through the library. And of course, it's a traditional to mention the Code of Ethics of the American Library Association. But of course, there are multiple statements across the world and across the library profession. The core value of protecting patron privacy has expressions, for example, among the Canadian library associations and the Association of Library Information Professionals of the Czech Republic. And not only is protecting patron privacy an ethical value, it is often a legal requirement. I think every state in the United States has specific legislation protecting the confidentiality of library records. And while there hasn't been a ton of litigation, there has been some, and it is a positive duty of libraries to um, to protect patron privacy. So what this means is that in order to work with any sort of integration or third-party system, particularly around patron data, there are some considerations to be aware of. And I should mention, by the way, that for the rest of this talk, the focus will largely be on patron data, both data that identifies the person and data that describes their specific use of the library catalog. Um, Data about library collections, of course, mostly can be shared freely with the world. Um, there of course is also acquisitions data that may have more confidentiality, but for the most part, we're talking about patron data for the rest of the presentation. So, what are the considerations before making a decision to share data? Um, One key consideration is it's important to know um, what is proposed to be shared. Um, so that could range from, say, if you are working with a library collections agency, you know, determining that, okay, you will need to share patron contact information. You also need to share enough information about the overdue items so that any collections notices can have a basis to hopefully get the book back. Um, but other situations may not require that degree of information. So in principle, working with an ebook provider, um, the ebook provider may not actually need to know anything about the patron other than that they are a distinct person. Um, and knowing what you are um, proposing to share also has to be tied in with why you're sharing it in the first place. it's important that a concrete purpose be identified. It could range from serving the needs of the patrons or enhancing the services that the libraries provide to the patrons. Or it could be necessary in order to meet other responsibilities of the library. And then once you know in general what is to be collected by the third party and why, another consideration before you share any data at all is figuring out what is the minimum amount of data that will serve the purpose. So, for example, if you are working with a third party to maintain a list, a mailing list to send out your newsletter, it may be sufficient for them to just have the patrons' email addresses. It, at least for many newsletters, there may be no need whatsoever to share anything more about the patron, and in particular, no need to share anything about their hold requests or their loans. And then another key factor before making a decision to share is minimizing the retention of the data that's collected. So, for example, back to the case of library collections, the collections agency, if they're given the name, contact information, and description of overdue items that the library is trying to get back, once the collection agency has either succeeded or has reached the point where they and the library agree that the collection effort should be abandoned, there's no need necessarily for them to hang on to any information about the patron or that particular interaction. So it is important to be clear with respect to expectations around how long the third party hangs on to any particular data element. Especially since, from one point of view, remember, library data and patron data can be toxic waste. Even if you have to deal with the toxic waste, that doesn't mean that you want to hang on to it any longer than you have to. So ideally, in arrangements with third-party services, there's a mutual recognition that the data should be retained as long as necessary and no longer. So once you've made a decision that you will consider sharing that data, in order to interact with a third party, there are other considerations as part of planning for and doing the sharing. So again, what is the purpose of sharing data? And in one sense, this is an overlapping with the previous slide, but it is important to always keep specific purposes in mind, and to avoid situations where you share data inadvertently or share data for experimental purposes without any real purpose in mind that's tied to the needs of the libraries and tied to the needs of the patrons. And of course, related to that, the principle of data minimization is double checking whether the ultimate purpose can be met without sharing patron information at all. And related to that is a consideration about, is it possible for the patron to give meaningful consent for their individual data to be shared? Now, in some cases, the answer may be no. If you use a collections agency to get materials back, that, as a matter of library policy, that the patron, hopefully was made aware of when they got the library card, may mean that they don't, have an option but to, have their overdue loans sent to collections. And, in that kind of situation, an individual opt-out may not be possible. However, there are other types of cases where not only can the patron be given the opportunity to opt in or to opt out, they should be given that opportunity. And an example of that would be, for example, at the level of signing up for a library newsletter, where ideally it should be fully opt-in, with the ability of the patron to unsubscribe at any time. But this can also apply to other types of situations. One example would be ancillary utilities that the patron may choose to take advantage of, possibly without any direct involvement by the library at all. So an example might be if a patron, or a super patron says, okay, I want to keep track of all of my checkouts, but not in the library's systems. In principle, they could use the Evergreen API to harvest their activity and choose not to retain search history in Evergreen. They could potentially do things like create software to monitor holder requests at all 10 of the libraries that they have cards at, because remember, we're talking about a super patron here. And use this software to manage other holds, and when the first library wins by providing the resource to the patron, cancel the holds at the other 10 libraries. And in one sense, this is somewhat an artificial example, but it can also be representative of situations where patrons with the wherewithal to do more sophisticated things with their own records ideally should be accorded the opportunity to do so. So in one sense, that goes beyond the consent to empowering patrons to make active use of the library transaction data that in one sense they own. And of course, the next point, how long does the data need to be retained? On the one hand, that is a callback to the previous slide, but it also points to what needs to be an ongoing consideration of periodically reviewing your data sharing arrangements to make sure that they still make sense, that the technical controls are in place, and that the business purpose for the library is still being met. And of course, a very important thing with respect to sharing is making sure that the recipient of the data has adequate security controls on their end. So that would include things like making sure that they've thought about such issues at all, rather than just assume that they can, stick things into a database and forget about it. Making sure that they have, uh, you know, a retention policy, making sure, particularly if you are in a GDPR jurisdiction, that they can service requests, by patrons to gain access to the patron's data, or to remove or correct it. And ideally, the security controls of the recipient would be at least as good, if not better, than the library's own security controls. So, some of these metadata sharing decisions are in easy mode. Um, most public libraries and most academic libraries, what the library holds is not a secret, and putting aside the scourge of web crawlers nowadays, many libraries make active efforts to share their catalog metadata with the world. And metadata about the library itself, also generally not sensitive. After all, you want your patrons to know where the library branches are, and what the um, hours of operation are. And then, for a different reason, I would argue that other types of information, the decision making is also, in a sense, in easy mode. So, personally identifiable information, that in general you should be wary about sharing unless it's strictly necessary. And of course, library records, as defined in your home jurisdiction, um, should not be shared except as permitted by the law. And of course, patron usage data, which can include circulation, but also can include things like saved searches or other usage analytics. Um, should The decision making should be biased towards not sharing this information unless absolutely necessary to meet a legitimate purpose of the library. And I see Chris Sharp's comment in chat. You know, I would say that, yeah, a degree of skepticism can sometimes be a good idea about why a given service may need particular data elements. And in fact, that can also be a type of skepticism that should be directed within the library itself, as in, the library should also be asking questions about, do you need this particular data element? For example, do you need social security numbers? Well, nowadays the answer is obviously not, but that is something that did actually take years to come to a consensus to. Um, Raise your hand in chat if your high school ID or college ID was your social security number. I know mine was. Um, so, with with that respect to one of the themes of this presentation, data as a toxic waste, the toxicity is not just about the data that gets handed over to um, third parties. It's about the data that's collected by the library, period. And yes, I acknowledge, Bridget, that I am dating dating many of us with this question about the social security number as an identifier. Now, the existence of an easy mode for decision making about data sharing does, of course, imply the existence of a hard mode. So, one example of that is there are, of course, lots and lots of reasons for libraries to deal with aggregated statistical data and to make use of tools outside the iOS to deal with this circulation, this circulation data. But there's a big caveat. The more data elements you include, the more that there's the potential for the data to be used to re-identify the patron who made specific circulation transactions, or to at least gain a sense of what patrons will be, what their general interests have been. And, a couple slides back, I mentioned the notion of empowering patron access to use their own data as they see fit. But there's also a trade off here. iOS as a class, for lots of historical reasons and customer service reasons, don't treat password complexity as something that's been strictly enforced since the 1980s. And of course, from a customer service point of view, lots of good reasons for that. Somebody whose interaction with technology and computer systems may potentially be largely at the library may not be in a position to manage complicated passwords. Many systems such as self-check devices also tend to expect that patron passwords are really just numeric pins. And of course, while systems like Evergreen are either have or are rolling out more sophisticated authentication, including single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, that is generally not something where at present it can be anything more than an option at best on the patron side. And I think there's a whole lot of user education by libraries, but not just by libraries, to get things to the point where multi-factor authentication gets consistently used by patrons for the library catalog and isn't a complete customer support headache. Another thing about the hard mode, or another aspect of it, has to do with decision making within the library. And that's the factor of here's a new shiny service, and clearly this will obviously be good for the patron, and it's a good idea to share as much data as possible. And that is a temptation that happens a lot. So, there have been many, cases over the years where, there has been internal debate and sometimes even internal conflict within libraries around, adding new third-party integrations that can be useful for the patrons, but are not necessarily weighed against the costs and the risks of sharing patron data. So how do we deal with this? So for anybody he was expecting a purely technical presentation. Well, I'm probably also dating myself, but a good chunk of it actually has to do with administrative controls. So one thing I highly recommend is that libraries maintain or create a registry or catalog of how patron data is shared. To identify where it's stored, where it's officially stored, as well as an inventory of all of the systems that legitimately may have access to that data. There should also be a process for setting up new data sharing arrangements, and those arrangements should ideally have a contractual basis with the data processors who will be dealing with the data. And like so many things in administration, maintenance is one of the considerations. So it's not enough to have a data sharing arrangement set up. It's also something that should be looked at periodically to make sure that it still makes sense to prune any data sharing that's no longer in use, and to actively seek out opportunities where perhaps the amount or types of data can be pruned back. So to take those in order, beginning first with the registry, um, this is basically just a list identifying all of the data sharing arrangements. Um, and I know ideally all, but at minimum the ones with external parties. The reason I put that is particularly for large libraries, there's actually a legitimate reason to make sure that the data sharing controls also apply internally. Now, of course, some of that happens anyway. You know, you give out, Evergreen staff accounts have permissions and authentication for a reason. But that also can apply to batch purposes. For example, the library's marketing team may have a legitimate interest and need for contact information for patrons, but that doesn't mean that the marketing team per se, especially if you're a library large enough to have a dedicated marketing team, it doesn't mean that that team should have, has any business use or need for circulation records. And then to, continue harping on the theme, there should be a purpose documented for each data sharing arrangement. Um, it should be noted the term of each arrangement, and by this I mean, when the agreement starts and stops. And it should also have a list of the elements that are shared as part of that arrangement. So another aspect of the process is, you know, you know, having a process for establishing new data sharing arrangements. So one key aspect is that data sharing happens intentionally, that it doesn't happen by accident or just because somebody decided to do some data analysis. The specific purpose should be documented. And ideally, the analysis of what's needed or what may be needed should be done before any contracts are signed. Um, it's a lot easier to not share circulation data, before an agreement is signed, and it's important to have a clear notion of what's actually needed, and that potentially can be a criterion to use if you're comparing multiple providers of a particular service about which one can do the work with the least amount of privileged patron data. And another key thing is central review of all arrangements, and that's in the context of a library, making sure that there's some central locus of review and responsibility for vetting such arrangements. And I will point out in chat that Chris Sharp and Kathy Lucier are making a very good point that consortium managers and central offices are in a somewhat different, can be in a somewhat different place with respect to, the consortium does not own the patron data generally, but they can be called upon to facilitate arrangements on behalf of their member libraries. And of course, that also speaks to data sharing arrangements, that might be reflected in agreements between the consortium and their member libraries, as well as technical controls within Evergreen to limit sharing even among member libraries. So, for example, the Evergreen patron opt-in feature, which BC Sitka uses extensively, is an example of a modality that doesn't assume that every authorized member, staff member of a member library should should automatically have access to all of the other libraries' patron data. So, generally speaking, the data sharing arrangement will get embodied in some sort of a contract. So, let me preface this by saying, I'm neither a lawyer nor do I play one on television. But some things that you should keep in mind are being clear about who's receiving of the data, including any subcontractors or processors, making sure that data retention has specific terms, and that applies both to ongoing operations as well as what happens if the service provider were to go out of business or get acquired by somebody else. Being clear about who legally controls of the data, and being clear about whether any of the data is to be aggregated with data from other libraries. And one thing I should have put on this slide, or at least it's made more explicit, ensuring that the data is not shared with anybody else for any reason other than the specific basis for the agreement. So, so for example, sharing data for sharing patron email addresses for a newsletter doesn't mean that the service provider should be able to share it with data brokers, as kind of an extreme example. And then, like I said, this needs to be done, looked at periodically. Does the data need to be shared? Has the underlying agreement changed? And I bring this up because sometimes you're dealing with a terms of service that the provider has reserved the right to change at will. And also verifying your technical controls. That changes to the software haven't resulted in more data being shared than you intended. Now, of course, there can be some gotchas at the administrative level. oh, data security, that's just something for systems to deal with. Um, and while arguably, systems, the systems librarian may be best situated to maintain the central registry. Um, every unit in the library needs to be on board with how data is responsibly used. Otherwise, you risk situations where somebody does something like, oh, I'm just going to run a patron report and send it over to a marketing firm or something like that. And another thing that can be a source of discussion and conflict is chasing the shiny. Something may be cool, it may be a priority of the director or the board or the marketing team, um, but there should be a way to at least interpose a roadblock for the review stage, if nothing else, and for everybody to be fully aware of any potential risks and or liability from uh, oversharing. And this, by the way, is not a theoretical risk. Um, just ask the Santa Cruz Public Library that back in 2019, I believe, literally had the local grand jury look into their data analytics practices. So let's talk a bit about moving on from the administrative to the more concrete side. Um, what technical controls can look like. So one aspect to keep in mind is there are modalities about pushing the data out. So that could include using reports of various stripes or running export programs to send the data to the recipient, as well as pull approaches where the recipient is using the Evergreen API or direct database access to fetch data as needed. And there isn't an inherent one is better than the other. There are pros and cons with both broad approaches regarding the degree to which you have control over the data versus the degree to which the application may need immediate and frequent update access or need to update the data. Um, so this list of pros and cons is not necessarily comprehensive, but it does give a notion of the sorts of things you should be thinking about with respect to um, the which method to use for any given project. And then, of course, the act of sharing data inherently means sending it somewhere. So secure transport is important. Nowadays, there's no excuse for not having the data be encrypted in transit through a variety of means. Um, and up to and including if for some reason email is the only approach you have, making sure that it's encrypted. With respect to reports, if you're creating the reports, it's a good idea to make sure that you're minimizing the number of patron fields you include, and also be sensitive to the possibility for re-identification attacks. So, for example, generally speaking, the patron profile, say adult versus juvenile, will be at a high enough, level of granularity for statistical purposes, but it's not perfect. Let's say you're a staff member with a Cat2 account checking out materials, and you're the only Cat2 account. Well, entire circulation history, arguably has just become available through a statistical report. So this, by the way, is a reason why you shouldn't do personal circulation on your Evergreen staff account. And with respect to the pool side, API access is something that can be managed through Surface accounts, and the RESTful API layer available as of Evergreen 3.15 will also provide other authentication mechanisms. Key thing here, pay careful attention to the permissions that the Surface accounts has, and this will often mean custom permission groups. On the direct SQL access side, some techniques to try include using views on top of the Evergreen tables to restrict exactly which records and columns are made available to the third party. And those views can also be set up as IDL views in Evergreen in order to provide API access or to use them in reporting. Postgres also offers a permissions structure that lets you restrict access both to specific views and tables, as well as which rows are made available. So, a couple examples, which I'll skip over. But the key thing I want to emphasize is if you do nothing else, if you don't have it already, please conduct a review of all the systems that connect to your Evergreen system, and at least make sure you have a list of the data sharing, and put this inventory together. But also make sure that you're paying attention to the technical side to ensure that data is being securely transmitted, and that you are minimizing the amount of data elements that are shared to just the ones that are strictly necessary for the use case. So that takes us to the inevitable ending slide with a cat picture. Please say hello to George and Tuna. And I think we have time for one, maybe two questions. And a couple of things I do want to highlight from chat. I very much like Noble's approach for having a confidentiality agreement. Also noting Kathy's comment about some of the nuances that can occur about things like family accounts, incorrect data, and so on. All right, so Jessica had a question. Are there any resources for conducting agreements, policies, and so on to recommend? I think the starting point I would put forward would be the work of various committees at AOA that have been done on the privacy space. So I will follow up later with links to specific resources, and echoing Chris Sharp's point about data security as part of system evaluation and RFIP templates. So with that, I think we're basically at time. thank you very much for your time and attention to this presentation, and I hope you found it useful.
Thank you, Galen. I just want to remind folks that it is a break in exhibitor time, and then at 2:30 the exhibitor lightning talks will be taking place. So have a great rest of your conference.